Peter sat down and looked at the wallaby. He felt it with his hands. "Eat?" he asked. "Yimara?" The bush boy smiled and got up. He climbed down from the rocks. He looked at different rocks and stopped in front of a big flat piece. Then he found some wood. Peter watched, but he didn't understand. "Lorana," said the bush boy. He began to build a fire. "I know!" Peter was excited. "Fire! You're going to make a fire." "Lorana," said the bush boy again. "Okay, Lorana. You're going to make a Lorana. I'll help." The bush boy found more wood and Peter helped him. But Peter stopped suddenly. "How can we light a fire?" he asked, "when we haven't got any?" Peter didn't finish his question, but watched the bush boy with his mouth open. "Australian trees have very dry wood, and Aboriginals can make fire in the old way." The bush boy sat by the flat rock. He put some very small pieces of wood on the rock. Then he took a long piece of wood between his hands. He put the end of this into the small pieces and moved it round and round very fast, and very quickly there was a good fire. "That's clever," said Peter. He put some more wood on the fire. Mary sat alone and watched the boys. Peter followed the bush boy everywhere. He didn't want her now. Boys didn't want to be with girls. "Why can't I be a boy too?" she thought. She watched the smoke from the fire sadly. The boy took the wallaby and cooked it slowly on the fire. An hour later, they sat down near the fire and ate it. A dingo sat on a rock only 10 meters away and watched them. There was a lot of meat and they ate it all. There wasn't any meat for the dingo. Now they were tired. The bush boy put some water on the fire. Then the 3 children slept. Mary woke up first before the sun was up. She watched the sky. What was up there? Another life? Life after death? Heaven? She didn't know. She looked at the naked bush boy and then looked away quickly. "Why am I not a boy too?" she thought. "Life is easy for boys." She thought about life in the bush with the black boy. He knew the desert and he could survive. That was good. Then Peter woke up. He sat up and looked at Mary, and then at the bush boy. "How can we get to Adelaide, Mary? Will the boy take us?" At home in South Carolina, she usually knew the answers to Peter's questions. But here in the bush, she didn't. "I don't know," she said. "Perhaps he doesn't know Adelaide. And how can we ask him? We don't speak his language." There were other questions about the boy in Mary's head, too. Why was he alone in the desert? Where was his family? What was best for her and Peter? She didn't have any answers. "Let's wait and see," she said to Peter. "I'm not in charge now," she thought, and then she felt better. She closed her eyes and fell asleep again. She woke up after about 2 hours. Half asleep, she could hear the boys. "What are you laughing at, Peter?" she called. But Peter couldn't hear her, so he didn't answer. He shouted and played with the bush boy in the water. Mary sat up and saw the 2 boys. Peter looked back. "Mary," he shouted, "come here and play with us." "Later," she shouted back, "when it's warmer." Peter ran after the bush boy. They ran round some rocks. Then the bush boy stopped suddenly. "Warwara," he said, excited. On the ground there was a brown ball. It was the top of a plant. Peter felt the brown ball with his hand. "Yimara?" he asked. The bush boy smiled. Yes, it was food. He pulled the strange plant out of the ground. The bottom of the plant under the ground was green, and there was also a pretty flower. The bush boy was happy. It was good food. They ran into the desert and looked for other warwara. Mary waited alone. Then she went down to the river. She swam and played in the water. Half an hour later, she heard the boys. They were back. She got out of the water quickly and put on her dress. The boys had 20 or 30 warwara in their arms. But now Peter was naked too. "Pete, where are your clothes?" "Oh, Mary, stop being big sister, do this, do that." "Peter," she said, "come here." She had her brother's trousers in her hands. "Oh, Mary, it's too hot, I don't want any clothes." "Put them on," she said. Peter wasn't happy, but he went to Mary. He looked at her. "Okay," he said. "I'll wear the trousers, but not the shirt." Later they found wood and made a fire. The bush boy taught Peter to move the big piece of wood fast on the small pieces. Peter tried very hard. It took a long time, but in the end the fire was red. "It's easy," Peter shouted happily. They cooked the warwara and they were very good. Mary watched the black boy. He was clean and strong. That was good. But why was he naked? Where were his clothes? She didn't understand. Everything was different in her world in South Carolina. After the food, they felt good. Peter put his hands on his stomach. It was very big now, and he started to laugh. The bush boy laughed and put his hands on his stomach too. Then he stood up and started to do an Aboriginal dance. First it was slow, but then it was faster and faster. And then it was stranger and stranger. He danced round and round the fire. Then he stopped in front of Mary. He looked at her, and she looked at him. Nobody moved. Mary was suddenly afraid, and her eyes were wide open. The bush boy's eyes were wide open too. He wasn't afraid, but for the first time he saw a girl. Mary was a girl, a lubra. She wasn't the same as Peter. Then the boy saw something in the girl's eyes. It was dark and strange. She was afraid. To him, that could mean only one thing. The girl saw death, his death. For the bush boy and for his tribe, there was a life plan. You were born, and then you walked with your tribe. After that, you walked alone on your walkabout. Then you were a man, and you lived with a woman. And after that, you died. It never changed. That was life. Now the bush boy walked alone. He was on his walkabout. He had to live in the desert alone for 6 months. He had to find food and water. He had to kill animals and find fruit on the trees. Every day was dangerous for him. After his walkabout, he was a man. But the girl could see his death, so there was no future for him. Everything was different for him now. He stood in the middle of the desert. "I'm going to die," he thought. He was very cold, but he wasn't afraid. Peter looked at the older children. "Hey, boy, dance again, I liked that." The other two didn't move. They didn't speak. It was very strange. Peter didn't understand. "Hey, Mary, what's happening?" He took Mary's hand and then he began to cry. The bush boy looked at him, so Peter could see his death too. He turned and slowly walked into the desert. The children watched him. Mary's face was white. Peter was afraid. "Mary, he's leaving, what'll we do?" he cried. He ran into the desert after the bush boy. "Hey, boy, stop, come back, come back." The bush boy didn't hear or didn't listen, but Peter ran after him. "Don't go," he shouted again. The bush boy stopped and put his hands on Peter's head. He pushed him away and started to walk again, but Peter followed him. Don't go, he said again and again. The bush boy stopped. He turned round and looked at Peter. When Peter sees my death in my eyes, he'll run away, he thought. Then I can go. But Peter took the bush boy's hand. He looked at him and smiled. "That's strange," thought the bush boy. "Perhaps I'm not going to die. Perhaps I'm wrong." He turned round and looked at Mary. Perhaps she's wrong. Perhaps death isn't coming for me now. Perhaps it's on its way to other tribes. He walked back to Mary, but she moved away. She was afraid. He saw it in her eyes. "So I am going to die," he thought. "Perhaps not today, not tomorrow, and not the next day. But before the rains come." Chapter 4. The bush boy thought about the two children. They didn't know the desert and they couldn't find food without him. "They'll die too," he thought. Then he had an idea. He had to take the children to the rivers under the mountains. That was the end of his walkabout and a good place for them. There was water and food. There were white people not far from there too. How much time did they have? Not much, perhaps. They had to go quickly. He put out the fire and took the warwara in his arms. "Kurura," he said. He walked into the desert. Peter followed, but Mary didn't move. Then she got up. "Where's he going?" "I hope he knows," she thought, and she started to follow too. They walked in the desert for a long time, up and down, over big rocks and across dry rivers. They went through tall trees and thick plants. It was hot and dirty, but the colors were beautiful. Yellows, greens, and reds. The bush boy never stopped or looked back. He knew the way. Then the desert was suddenly more friendly. The trees were taller and there were a lot of birds and a river. It was midday and the sun was very hot. The boys drank water from the river with their hands. They put their heads in the water. Mary drank too, but she didn't go near the bush boy. When he looked at her, she looked away. "What's wrong, Mary?" asked Peter. "Why are you afraid?" Mary didn't move, and she didn't say anything. Peter didn't understand. But Mary was strange sometimes. Girls were often strange. He went to the bush boy and sat next to him. They ate the warwara. Peter gave some to Mary, and she ate them too. It was very hot. So they stayed under the trees near the water for 3 hours. Then the bush boy got up and started to walk again. He usually walked 45 kilometers in a day, but Peter got tired quickly. So they only walked 25. On the way, the bush boy killed a big bustard and they ate it for dinner. Then they felt sleepy. That night it was cold, but the rocks stayed warm from the sun. So each child found a big flat rock, but Mary couldn't sleep. "Peter." "Yes?" "Come and sleep next to me, please." "Why?" "I'm cold." "Okay." He fell asleep next to her, but Mary watched the bush boy. "I won't close my eyes. I'll watch him all night," she thought. But she was very tired, and of course she fell asleep. The bush boy didn't sleep. Hour after hour he stood there on the rocks. He looked out at the desert. He didn't move and he didn't make any noise. The children walked the next day and the next day and the day after that. They stopped for the wee hours at midday when the sun was very hot. They found food, plants, fish, and small animals. They made fires and cooked their food. They swam in rivers and they slept on rocks or under trees. Peter talked to the bush boy. He learnt more of the bush boy's language. He showed him a rock. "What do you call this?" he asked. "Garsha," answered the bush boy. "Garsha," Garsha repeated Peter. On the 4th day, it was very dry and they didn't find any water. Peter walked slowly. He didn't feel very well. Then he sneezed. The bush boy began to laugh again. He remembered Peter's first sneeze. Peter sneezed again. "You've got a cold, Peter," said Mary. "I know," said Peter through his nose. He sneezed again. He sneezed all day and his nose was red. Aboriginals never sneezed and never caught colds. The bush boy didn't understand. "What's he doing? What's wrong with him?" asked the bush boy. But of course Mary and Peter didn't understand the question. That evening, Peter didn't help with the fire. He was too tired and too ill. Mary put her arms round him, and in a minute he was asleep. The bush boy cooked food for the two of them. Then he put out the fire. He was happier. The two children walked well, and it was not far now. He found a place to sleep. But suddenly he sneezed. He put his hand to his face. It felt hot. That was very strange. Perhaps he was ill too. In the morning, Peter felt better. He got up and looked for the bush boy. He saw him in the rocks and went down to him. The bush boy stood near some water. He had a large, round rock in his hands. He looked at Peter and smiled. "Yarawa," he said, excited. Peter looked. There were a lot of fish in the water. "Is that Yarawa?" he asked. There were thousands of little fish. They swam very fast. "Yarawa," said the bush boy again. "But how can you catch them?" asked Peter. The bush boy smiled again. He threw his rock into the water as hard as he could. The rock hit the water with a loud noise. The water came up round the two boys and over them too. But on the top of the water, Peter saw the fish. Now they didn't move. "Are they dead?" he asked. But of course they weren't. The bush boy jumped into the water. He took a lot of the fish and threw them onto the dry rocks. Then he climbed out of the water. He hit the fish on the head with a rock. He gave some fish to Peter, and he carried the other fish. They took them to Mary and cooked them for breakfast. They couldn't eat them all, so they carried some for their dinner later. That evening, they sat round the fire and ate Yarawa. Then the bush boy suddenly got up and started to dance. He danced round the fire. He danced very fast. Then suddenly, in the middle of his dance, he sneezed. He sneezed again and again. He felt weak and ill, so he sat down. He put his hand to his face, and it was hot and wet. But he also felt very cold, and now he was afraid. "This is the end," he thought. "I'm going to die now." Peter and Mary watched the bush boy. "What's he doing?" asked Peter. "I don't know," said Mary. "It's very strange. Perhaps he caught your cold." Later, when it was dark, Peter and Mary slept. But the bush boy stood on the rocks and looked out at the desert again for a long time. The fire was warm, and he tried to sleep near it. But he sneezed often, and he was very cold. He couldn't get warm. In the morning, he didn't make a fire, and there wasn't any breakfast. "Mary, is he ill?" asked Peter. "No, he's not ill," answered Mary. But she didn't really know. Peter went to the bush boy. "Hey boy, are you okay? Let's go, Adelaide, remember? We have to go to Adelaide." The bush boy stood up slowly. Yes, Peter was right. They had to leave. They walked all morning. Nobody said a word. They stopped for lunch, and the bush boy found some eggs. 14 big birds' eggs. The children cooked and ate them. The bush boy didn't eat. Then they were thirsty, but there wasn't any water. The bush boy was tired and weak. He didn't move for a long time. Then he got up and started to walk again. That night, Peter and Mary found wood for the fire. Next morning, Peter woke first. He walked down the rocks to the river and had a good swim. He climbed back to the others. "I'm going for a swim too," said Mary. Can you start a fire, Pete? Yes, of course. Peter walked to some trees and began to find wood for the fire. Mary had a long, long swim. The bush boy woke up alone. He felt very weak. I'm going to die, he thought. But first I have to ask the children for help. It's very important. They're my friends, but they don't understand. So I have to teach them about death in my tribe. He heard Mary in the river below and walked down to her. She was in the water and she was naked without her strange clothes. He watched her long hair in the water. It was very beautiful. Suddenly Mary looked up and saw him. She was very afraid. She moved away and she found a small rock. I can throw this at him, she thought. Go away, she shouted. The bush boy didn't understand and he came nearer. Stay there, don't come nearer. He saw hate in her eyes. She's not a friend, he thought. I can't talk to her, she won't help me. And the boy won't understand. He's too young, so I'll have to die alone. Slowly he turned and walked a little way into the desert. He found a sad muggawood tree. This is a good place, he thought. I'll die here. And only the great red flowers of the muggawood tree cried for him. Mary went back to Peter. She started to put out the fire. Hey, said Peter, don't do that. We're going to have breakfast. There isn't any breakfast. What do you mean? Listen, Peter. She spoke very quietly. There isn't any food here. Let's go. What's wrong with you, Mary? Why do you want to go now? The boy will get us some food. Listen, Pete, please, let's go. You and me will be okay. Peter's mouth fell open. We can't leave the boy. He doesn't want to come, Pete. I know he doesn't. I asked him. You didn't, said Peter. You can't talk the boy's language. I'm telling you, she said, that he doesn't want to come, I know. In South Carolina, Peter was never difficult. But now things were different. I'm going to ask him, he said. He ran to the bush boy. Pete, come back, shouted Mary. But Pete didn't stop. Mary sat down sadly by the fire. After about 10 minutes, Peter came back. Mary! The boy's ill, really ill. He's under a tree and he can't get up. Perhaps he's asleep. No, he's not asleep. He's ill. Come and see. No. Mary moved away from Peter. No, she said quietly. I'm not going near him. The day was long and difficult. Mary sat alone. We have to leave now, she said again and again. But Peter didn't hear her. He stayed with the bush boy. He took water to him in his hands, but the bush boy didn't drink. There wasn't any food, and the bush boy got weaker and weaker. He's really going to die, thought Peter sadly. I'm going to lose my friend. He took the bush boy's hand. The bush boy said something. Peter couldn't hear, so he put his face near the bush boy's head. Arkulula. Peter ran and got some water in his hands, but the boy didn't want to drink. He put his hands on Peter's hands. Me? No, I don't want to drink, said Peter. But the bush boy put his hands on Peter's hands again, and then he sat up. He showed him the hills far away to the south. Arkulula, said the bush boy again. Yimara. Ah, I understand. Over there's food and water. Arkulula and Yimara. That's great. Thanks. Peter took the boy's hand. Now you can sleep. But then Peter thought of something. He got up and walked to his sister. She looked up. How is he? I think he's really dying, said Peter. Oh no. Mary put her hands over her face. Peter looked at her. Then he remembered his question. Do you think he'll go to heaven, Mary? I mean, he doesn't go to church, so perhaps he can't go to heaven. Is he really ill, Pete? Yes, come quickly, come and see. Mary said nothing. She looked at Peter. Then she looked down at the rocks and she looked at the hills far away. Then she said slowly, Okay, I'll come. They walked to the bush boy's tree. She looked into his face. You're right, Pete. He's dying. What'll we do? She sat down and took the bush boy's head in her hands. She put her hands on his face. The bush boy opened his eyes and looked at her. Then he smiled. Mary suddenly understood a lot of things for the first time. I was very stupid, thought Mary. It was too late, but she knew now. There weren't two different worlds, his world and her world. There was one world for everybody. The bush boy died early in the morning. The desert was asleep. Nothing moved, not the animals, not the plants, not Mary. She was asleep too next to the bush boy, and her long hair fell over his face. Chapter 5. Mary and Peter made a bed on the ground for the dead boy. They put wood and rocks over him. Pete put some of the red flowers from the muggawood tree on the top. When a person died in South Carolina, everybody went to church. There was no church here. But they stayed quietly with the dead boy for a short time. They sat near him, but they said nothing. Then Peter stood up. He was in charge now. Let's go, he said. Karura. Where to? Over the mountains. Is that the right way, Pete? Mary asked. Yes, the boy told me. Over the mountains there's food and water. All right, she said. Let's go. They started to walk. They walked carefully and they found food and water. The bush boys' lessons helped them. They knew the desert now. That night they stopped and built a fire. They sat and talked sadly about the bush boy. Do you think he's in heaven, Mary? Yes. Yes, he's up there. I think he's watching us. We all live in the same world, Pete. When we die, there's only one place for all of us. Pete smiled. He looked up at the sky for a long time. Next morning, the children left early. They were in the hills now. They climbed and climbed. When they were at the top of one hill, there was always another hill behind it. The journey was difficult, and they didn't find much food. When they found water, it was often very dirty. But the desert was their home now. They too could survive there. South Carolina was far, far away. Is this the right way? Asked Mary again. Yes, yes, said Peter. The boy told me, over the hills. But there were always more hills. That night they slept in the rocks, but they had no food. Then the next day, after 3 hours, they came to the last hill. They were at the top. Look, Mary, Yimara and Arkulula, said Peter excitedly. The boy was right. At the bottom of the hill, everything was green. There was food and water below. Hand in hand, the children started to run down the mountain, to the rivers, the trees, and the green plants. The country was very beautiful. It was wonderful after their difficult life in the desert. There was food everywhere and a lot of water. There were birds in the trees and fish in the rivers. The plants and the trees had fruit on them. The children were a little afraid of the big, tall, dark trees, but then they began to play in them. Peter climbed up a tree. This is great, he shouted to Mary, and then she climbed the tree too. They played all day, and they were friends again. On the third day, they saw a koala in a tree. It was a mother koala with her baby. Pete went up into the tree. He took the baby from the mother and gave it to Mary. There now, play with that, said Peter. The mother koala started to make strange sounds. She wanted her baby. Oh, Peter, how could you do that, you bad boy? She tried to give the baby back to its mother, but it caught her dress. It pulled and pulled. Mary's dress came off and fell to the ground. "Oh, my dress," said Mary. She laughed. She felt good now with no clothes on. She was a different Mary now. "I never want to leave here," said Peter on the 6th day. The children played and played. They swam for hours in beautiful blue water. They forgot Adelaide and Uncle Keith, and they forgot their old life in South Carolina. Mary sometimes thought of home in Charleston, but not often. They were very, very happy. On the 7th day, the children found a beautiful wide river. They sat with their feet in the warm water. "Hey, look over there," said Peter. "Smoke. There's a fire." "And people," said Mary. "Yes, people. How many are there?" "3, I think." "Let's make a fire too. Then they'll see us." "Okay." They found wood and built a fire. The 3 people saw the smoke. They ran down to the water and started to swim across the river to Peter and Mary. "They're coming, Pete!" Mary was excited but also afraid. She didn't have any clothes now. She couldn't say hello without any clothes. Not to white people. "Do you think they're white, Pete?" Peter looked carefully. "No, I think they're black. They're the same as the boy," he said. She felt better. They stood near the river and watched. They saw a family of Aboriginals, a father, a mother, and a young girl, and on the father's head there was a baby. The mother and daughter swam with food and other things on their heads. There was a dog with them, too. They came near and climbed out of the water. They were friendly, and they smiled at Peter and Mary. The woman gave Mary some food. Peter played with the dog. The black people talked and talked. Mary didn't understand very much, but they talked with their hands too, and she watched carefully. "Wait a minute," thought Mary. "They're telling me something. Is that a house? Are those people? Yes, they're trying to help us." "Pete," she said, "they know we're lost. They're telling us about houses, about white people. They live over there. But where?" "Oh, where?" Then the black man made a map on the ground. He showed her a mountain, a road, and a house. He showed her a place for the night. They could sleep there. And he showed her food and water. It was 2 days' journey. Mary looked at the map and laughed. "What's funny?" asked Peter. She showed him the map. "Look at this map. Why do we use language?" she said. A little later, the family started to walk to the river. "I think they want to go now, Pete," she said. Peter went to the black man and put out his hand. "Goodbye," he said. The black man smiled and put out his hand too. Mary also said goodbye, and the family started to swim back across the river. Mary and Peter sat near the river and watched them. Then Peter stood up. He was ready for the journey home. "Are you coming, Mary?" he asked. Mary looked round her. "Oh, Pete." "What's wrong now, Mary?" Mary started to cry. "It's really, really beautiful here." "I know," said Peter. "I'll always remember this." He looked round at everything, too. Then he turned to Mary. "But we have to go, Mary. Let's go home. Kurura."